Okay, we're good. So the first step remains the same, which is identifying the research process. In this case, obviously, in qualitative research, you identify research participants in community. In quantitative research, what would you call that? What are you identifying in quantitative? Think of phase one, first steps. Identify sample, right? That's the equivalent of what you're doing. You collect data different ways, right? In quantitative research, you make measurements, or you, even if you're getting survey results, whatever it is, it's a little bit different. You still collect data. The way you collect data in qualitative is different because you're looking at interviews, focus groups, participant observations, ethnographies, etc. We should talk about ethnography a little more. I don't want to get distracted, so we'll finish up this comparison first, and then we'll talk about ethnographies. Okay. Then, of course, once you collect data, you interpret data. So that's still very similar. The process is similar. We have another participant. Well, there we go. So once you interpret data, the difference now starts, the big differences start here. In qualitative, you try to make sense of the data by developing a theory or explanation. What would be the comparable step after you interpret data in quantitative research?
Would you be looking for themes at this point?
Yeah, so you make conclusions to do what? Conclusions to validate hypothesis, right? So in that sense, it's quite different because you're really not trying to develop a theory at that point. You already have a hypothesis, and you're using your conclusions to validate a hypothesis or to, identify new data. But in qualitative, you have a next step. You refine the research question or identify new questions to ask participants based on gaps and understanding identified in your analysis of research. So this is suggesting that you have a recursive step, or you have a go back step involved, which absolutely does not exist in quantitative research. Once you make your new questions following your first initial interviews, you can use that to do more interviews and collect more data. Again, this is not something we do in quantitative research. We do it differently. You finish a study, you find some data, and you have a new study that comes up which looks at things a little differently based on the limitations of the data, because here you go to limitations, and then you go to a new study. So in that sense, it's much different. But then you go back to the final step, which is writing the research report is exactly the same. But notice this step. This is very, very important in qualitative research. As you refine the research questions and develop new questions, you're going to collect more data. And that means you have to go back, interpret the data, okay, and try to make sense of the data by developing a theory or explanation. And that could change. Your initial set of answers could give you a theory, but you develop new questions and you go back and do it again. And now you have new data which suggests you may have to change your theory, okay? Maybe not by much, but at least enough to make it more meaningful. And step 7 is important. Collect more data and repeat steps 4 through 7, 1, 4, 5, 6, and 7. Until saturation occurs. So the term saturation So this is a little bit of review from research literacy. Anybody remember what saturation means in qualitative research?
There's no more information to be gathered. All the points have been covered. There's no more useful or new information to be gathered.
Wonderful, Aretha. Thank you. Exactly. No new info. I'm going to let this participant in. Charlotte, come on in. Okay, so there's no new information to be gathered, and that's when you hit saturation. So you can only hit, you can't possibly hit saturation in qualitative research with your first set of interviews, because we are not, as much as we'd like to think, none of us as researchers is sufficiently sensitized to the data. And that's why you start with something. You got to start someplace. You develop your questions, you do your interviews, you collect your data, you identify themes, you try to put a theory together, and you find, well, I'm curious about this additional question which I want to ask. So you add that, or you add a few questions, or you change a few questions. And you go through the process a few times. Okay, so till you hit saturation, and it's only then you develop your final theory and write your research report. And that's how the process principally is the same, okay? But there's a whole section which is quite different between qualitative and quantitative research. So if you had to do this stepwise, this is a good this is a good way to remember the two pathways. Okay, so the same chapter has a pathway, or maybe the previous chapter has a pathway for quantitative research. Make sure that when you're asked about differences, obviously there are many differences between quantitative and qualitative research itself. But if you get a specific question, what is the difference in the research process in quantitative and qualitative research? You're expected to know how to make this flowchart. Okay, so that is an expectation. So you should be able to put this flowchart down and explain as to how they're different. I'm just going to erase all of this stuff because we don't need it, but we're going to talk about ethnographies a little bit more. One thing we forgot to cover during the chapter is ethnographies. Does anybody remember what an ethnography is?
Is that research that has to do with people or how they've lived their lives or something like that? Like a philanthropical side?
You're right, it is anthropological.
Anthropological, sorry.
It is anthropological, but it's also biographical, and it accounts for very ethnocentric experience. Not ethnocentric, ethnocentrism is a wrong term, but very ethnocultural experiences that a person encounters growing up. So ethnographies are done, they can be through interviews, they can be through diaries, and so on. So for example, if I wanted to look at ethnographies, what does it mean? So the question you'd ask to do an ethnography is, what does it mean to be, in my case, an East Indian man, you know, growing up? So then I would be interviewed, or I'd write my biography or whatever it is, and people would look at that and then analyze, and they might do it for a bunch of different people from the same background as myself. And what that would do is, hopefully it provides a rich enough narrative to the researcher to kind of pull out, well, this is what growing up East Indian in India feels like. Someone might get a question, well, what does it feel like being a French Canadian? What does it feel like to be Finnish in Sudbury? And so on, okay? So they are important. They are very personal. It is mostly qualitative research. There's no quantitative work in ethnography. And as Aretha said, they're based on an individual's construction of their own ethnicity. It is your own construct of your ethnicity, because obviously when you're being interviewed about your growing up in Sudbury or whatever be the case, it's your own construct. It's your own construct of who you see yourself to be. So, you know, you may not have thought about it, okay? But all of you have a different background. I can say that with full confidence. Unless you have siblings or twins in a class, I think pretty much everybody has a different slightly different ethnocultural background for the most part. Okay. All right. Any questions so far?
Professor, I know I'm late, but can you just tell me, where did you start today?
We started at this page. This is, I believe, the last page of your chapter.
Oh, okay, okay, I got it. Okay.
All right, we started talking about the differences, the research process in qualitative. Just a heads up to everybody, I will start sharp at 10. We won't wait, and the reason is that students in class have to get to their next class, and it just doesn't make sense. So if you aren't there, if you miss something, go back, see the recording, try to be on time, which is a good thing. But if you can't make it for whatever reason, go back and see the recording. And I'm happy to fill you in as long as, you know, we can still finish the content we need to in class. Okay?
Okay.
Okay, we are. Okay, so we're going to go solve the questions at the back of your textbook. And let's do it as a class. So question number 1. What are the basic steps in preparing to do research involving observation as a data gathering technique? How might they differ between qualitative and quantitative research?
Qualitative research.
Well, let's start by, let's address the questions in sequence. What are the basic steps we need to do involving observation? If you're going to collect data using observation, what are the things you need to do?
You need to organize what it is you're going to be looking for, your question, or what points you're looking for.
Okay, so you need to have research question.
Right.
You need to define what you're looking for.
Mm-hmm.
How you'll measure it?
Measuring instruments, how will you measure it? Yes. So when you say define what you're looking for, you're basically defining the variable, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Measure, what else? You are welcome to look through your textbook.
I know at some point you need some sheets. You need sheets to record.
Recording instruments?
Yes, like your summarization sheet.
Yeah, you're going to have data collection sheets, you're going to have summarization sheets, so you're going to have recording instruments. You may not use sheets, you folks might be too modern for me, you might use your phone, and that's okay. You need something to save that information, okay? So there are a bunch of different things you need. This is when you go through the observation paragraph or section in this chapter, you'll see what are the different steps that you need to do, okay? How might your sheets differ between qualitative and quantitative researches?
In qualitative research, as you progress, you
so we're talking strictly observations, okay? Continue. Sorry, Aretha, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want to make sure that everyone understands you're talking strictly about observations.
Okay. So as you progress with your sheets, in qualitative, there may become a point when another question or other questions may be raised. So you may need another, I've forgotten that sheet, to add that information or tweak as you go along towards your conclusion. I mean, you revisit. In quantitative, that element is not involved, so it's pretty much straightforward in your steps. And quantitative is usually information, secondary information. So it's already there. You're just taking out what's relevant to your research question. Qualitative can differ, especially if it's from primary, in that the response you got at one point or one period, one era, the same question may produce a different response, while quantitative, it's just static. Whatever it is at that point in time, that's what it is. And that's simply because qualitative has to do with people's experiences and their circumstances may change. Or I know that's winded.
Okay, well, you kind of, you gave some of the answers, so that's a good thing. So thank you for that, Aretha. So the thing about quantitative observations is it's a there or not there, okay? There's very little room for interpretation during data collection.
Yes.
It's very objective. Was there a responsive behavior? Was there not? Okay. Context tends to not be important. Of course, quantitative researchers will argue that no, it is important, but the degree to which importance is assigned is quite different between qualitative and quantitative. One of the biggest thing about qualitative information sheets, yes, you write down what you're measuring, but you may not be counting them. So incident at a rock concert. People jumping into line. What do you call that when people cut you out of line, out of turn?
Butting in.
Butting in, people butting in. Or you see, so in quantitative, you wouldn't worry about saying people butting in. You would probably go ahead and describe man butting in. And then you would have your own interpretation of the incident.
It happened 10 times in the evening.
You wouldn't count that in quantitative, in qualitative. You would have your interpretation. The man seemed like in a rush. He seemed a little bit drunk and he was upset and he was unhappy, so he butted in. So your own impressions of the incident. And you would record multiple set of different events, and you may have defined that I will look for incidences of bad behavior from males, incidences of antisocial behavior at a rock concert by men, okay? And all of a sudden, you start to look, and you start to look at different behaviors. You have your own interpretation of what happened, and then you go ahead at the end of your data collection. You go and look at all these things, and you notice a pattern that almost half of the people that engaged in antisocial behavior at the concert were either drunk or high. So there's a strong correlation between antisocial behavior and consumption of mind-altering substances or whatever it is. It's quite different from quantitative because there's a lot more context. You can actually describe in detail what was going on. There's a big line. They had only 2 counters, but there were 1,000 people standing. So there's a whole bunch of context, okay, that's provided in qualitative research. Quantitative research, if you're looking for antisocial behavior, you define 5 behaviors and you go check, 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 check. Wherever you see one, you go check. At the end of it, you just go ahead and write your report saying between 5 and 6 at the concert, there were so many behaviors that occurred. Between 6 and 10, there were so many, and so on. So that's a difference between what your data collection technique and sheets look like. There's very little of an interpretational lens that you use in quantitative research. Your interpretational lens comes together in qualitative, and it gets better as you do more and more. In quantitative research, once the parameters are set, it doesn't matter who's collecting the data. I could collect it, Jesse could collect it, Courtney could collect it, Marianne could collect it, Samantha could collect it. Doesn't matter. We'll all come to the same conclusion. Qualitative is a little different in the sense that it is very important as to who the observer is, because different observers have different skills of observation. They also have different degrees of sensitization to data. Okay, so how they look at a piece of information and how they interpret it is very, very different. It's not the same as just going and checking things in a box. So the observer happens to be very, very important. Okay, I think that pretty much answers the question how the sheets would be different. Go back to your textbook, go back to the chapter, take a look at how the sheets differ as well, just to give yourselves more of a solid explanation. Question 2. I think I'm going to get an excellent answer from all of you for this. What is the purpose of a checklist for observation? Why do we need a checklist? Marianne says, clarification of research objectives. Is that what your checklist is? What does a checklist do?
Helps keep us organized.
Keeps organized. What does it organize, Aretha?
The steps that we're trying to follow.
Is that what a checklist is? What is a checklist?
Ticks off the things as we accomplish them.
Oh, okay. So, so that's a different kind of checklist. So, perhaps this question should have been reframed. What is an observation checklist? An observation checklist is different from a regular checklist because you go through different steps and you check through them. Say, for example, I have 20 different things to do today. I finish each one and I put a check mark next to them. In our day-to-day lives, that would be a checklist. But an observation checklist is a little bit different, right?
Think about follow a specific order.
It's not for the order. It's to allow you to score for all the different variables. So if you're thinking about classroom behavior, okay, and you have different behaviors that you're, say, hair pulling, giggling, throwing paper, playing with hair. Okay, and then you're counting, okay? So an observation checklist, because you're observing for these behaviors, this is what an observation checklist looks like. And in your textbook, they might have checks instead of the statistical way of denoting it. It doesn't matter, it's the same meaning. Your observation checklist is, it does help clarify. So there's some, so you folks had some of the answers, so that's excellent. But it's more of a sheet to help you track the changes in the different variables that you're looking. Okay, it absolutely helps you stay organized, but it's different from a checklist where you have a process. You know, you have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 of your research. And then you have 5 steps to phase 1, and you have 2 to phase 2 and 3 to phase 3 or something like that. And you go through each one, check, done this, done this, done this, done this, done this. No, that's not what they're looking for. So they're asking you more specifically a checklist for observation. And the checklist for observation is typically to help you collect data systematically. Okay, now a checklist for observing disruptive behavior at a rock concert as a qualitative scientist, you can have a checklist if you have defined what kind of behaviors you're looking at and the context. Sometimes it can be an empty sheet allowing you to actually make your checklist as you go along. So what you can have for qualitative research is you can have a checklist, and we're pretending these are large, like full letter size sheets. I'm just doing a mini version of these. So, your observation of disruptive behavior, so your behavior that you observe, and perhaps you can create a third box. So you say context, and then you have your own interpretation. And then perhaps you don't know what behavior to expect. So you leave this blank, and then you notice your first behavior, you notice your second one, you notice your third one, you notice your fourth one, and so on. So it's different in that sense. Your qualitative checklist can be quite different. Okay. Thank you for answering. Don't get put off if I don't agree with your answer 100%. You always give me something, so that's a good thing. Thank you. Not all of our answers are going to be perfect. Mine definitely aren't, and you're going to find things in the textbook that I may have forgotten to mention to you. So that's why you should read your textbook. Attend my lectures, but read the textbook. Anyway, good. All right, let's go to the next question now. Clear this. Okay, great. What is the purpose of a data summarization sheet? So you have your data collection sheet and you have your data summarization sheet. What does your data summarization sheet do? What do
It lists the quantities of your observation, in that if there were 3 pulling of hairs, if there were 5 punching, on your checklist, you would have them as they occur. At 10 o'clock a punch, 2 o'clock a punch, 3 o'clock. You summarize everything, the total punches for that period of observation. So you would have each behavior recorded just once.
Yeah, 100%. That's the answer. So as Aretha said, your data collection sheets tend to be more of raw data that you collect. So, it might look like, if you're looking at responsive behaviors, and let's use Aretha's example. So you have behavior and you have different behaviors: kick, punch, shove, pull. And you're collecting this, at, let's say, at breakfast. And you notice incidents, this happens a couple times, this happens like 3 times, this happens once. Go ahead, Charlotte, did you have a comment?
I think the purpose of the data summarization sheet is to be simple and direct with answering questions.
That's right, Kylie. Yeah. Well, it's so that you can get all your information at a first glance. So for example, if you collected sheets for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, this is your data collection sheet. The issue is we're collecting numbers, as Aretha said, but the challenge obviously is that if you collect sheets over a 30-day period, you're a good researcher, you're a diligent researcher, you don't want to make invalid conclusions. So you collect this data over 30 days to make sense of what's going on at a long-term care facility. But then now you're stuck with 30 sheets. And you can't present 30 sheets to anybody. Nobody wants to look at 30 sheets of raw data. So that's why you can make a data summarization sheet where you can just talk about behaviors, and you actually have, you can have it as breakfast, lunch, dinner, or you can have it all together, and then you have a number here, 25, 23 for different behaviors, 22 and 21 and so on. So that's the reason you have your summarization sheets, essentially to compress all that data into meaningful form. Your data summarization sheet may not be the final way you present data. You may have to end up making a graph or a chart to represent it. Okay. We didn't do a couple of things. We didn't talk about it, but we will talk about it now because we have time. What are the basic steps in preparing research involving the use of a questionnaire or an interview guide? So
we prepare our questions. I remember that we prepare the. If it's quantitative, it's like a pretty much closed-ended questions. We just want specific response. For qualitative, we leave it like open-ended, some of the questions. As we go along, we are, I forget the next immediate
it's okay,
steps.
it's okay. You know, the good thing is this is actually listed as a list. And I'll just take you to the portion of the textbook where it does. So the good thing is all of these answers to your questions are right in the chapter, and particularly for this chapter, they're really well organized. So for everything, you have to first define what your question is.
Yeah.
Okay. And we'll do a little bit about attitudinal surveys because we didn't do that during our last two lectures. Bear with me, it's moving as fast as it possibly can. I wish I remembered all the page numbers by heart. Or okay, there we go.
Page 102.
102, there we go. Thank you, Aretha. So if you go to page 102.
A questionnaire on time spent studying.
Oh, that's the questionnaire itself. No, there's a page that actually lists the steps as to what you have to do for setting up a questionnaire or survey. There we go. There's a checklist for observations in case you were interested. That's on page 100. Those are the key steps. When you use interview guides and questionnaires to measure variables and concepts, yep. I guess you just have the helpful hints. You don't have a list. You just have a bunch of helpful hints. But if you want to look at that, perhaps you should look at it. This is very interesting. Okay. So on page 103 of your textbook, there are some helpful hints for writing questionnaires and respond to questions, you know, rather than questions about opinions or attitudes. So again, it's very similar to writing the setup for any research. You clarify exactly what it is you want to know. It's also important, obviously, to ask yourself what it is you expect from your study, and how does your question, each question. So if you have an interview, you will have multiple questions at some point. It has to be related to the question you're asking. You don't want a question just for casual interest, okay? Always be direct and simple when asking questions. So the last thing you want is, you know, if you ask a complex question during a questionnaire or a survey, what could happen? What do you think would happen if you asked a very complex question?
The response you get may not be meaningful to your research objective because
people may not choose to answer it, or people may answer one portion of it and not another, right? And they give an example. In the past 24 months, on how many occasions have you taken a leave of absence from your usual activities in your home and your place of work to take up temporary residence in another locality for the purposes of recreational activities, relief of stress, and a conscious perception of a change in environment?
Too many
How would you like
questions in
to
that
answer?
question.
Okay. See, you know, they lost me after the first line, right? So you can't ask questions like that. That's like 6 questions in one. You can't answer that. Even if that was an interview question, you can't answer that. What would you do if you were faced with such a question for an interview? I'm going to spend 5 minutes thinking about it, and I'm not going to be able to answer anything. Okay? A more direct question, obviously, is in the past 2 years, how many times have you taken a vacation away from your home and your job? Simple. Okay. I took a vacation twice, but once I was at home, so I actually took a vacation away from my work and home just once. Simple. You can answer that. Okay. All interviews, all questionnaires will have something called a face sheet. The face sheet picks up demographic information. You might be talking to people who have recovered from a heart attack or a stroke or for some mental trauma. But often the data becomes more meaningful if you know whether they're male, whether they're female, what their age range is. You don't need a specific age, and to know what other medical or health conditions they have. This kind of a sheet, a face sheet, typically asks demographic questions. And you know, depending on your research, it can talk about their sex, religion, marital status, education, income, and number of children. Now, it may not have a usually the questions that are asked have a range. So they don't necessarily ask you exactly, well, how old are you or what month were you born? But they have a range so that they can say, okay, well, men between the ages of 65 and 75 are typically concerned about decreasing libido. Okay, might be a question, you know, as if you want. So you have a range. You don't have a very specific question. Typically, the recommendation for a questionnaire or an interview is only ask demographic questions that are directly related to your project. There's really no point in asking people about the number of relationships in the past if you are doing a questionnaire, survey, or interview about the use of drugs for erectile dysfunction. Even though it sounds like it might be of interest, they really aren't related, okay? So you have to be careful. When you write your questions, you really have to think about what you want to ask them. The next point, make sure that each question is clear and gets a simple response of fact and not one of evaluation. Now, this is important for a questionnaire or a very structured interview. So if you are doing an interview, like an unstructured interview, asking a mom, how do you feel about the amount of television your child watches, would be an open-ended question. But if it's a questionnaire, that's a bad idea. You're not going to get a response. It's better to ask, how many hours of TV did your child watch this week, every night? Okay, approximately. So, you know, you'll get more factual answers. When administering an interview or survey questions, direct it to the right person. If you want to know how many hours workers spend in their job at the workplace, who should you ask? Should you ask the boss? Should you ask co-workers, or should you ask the person who's doing the work?
Off the bat, we'd be tempted to ask the boss because we're thinking that they're the ones that look at the timesheets, right? But it's actually the worker, really.
Right. Especially if you want a very honest answer and you can promise them anonymity. And they can say, can you tell us how many hours in a day do you actually work? Because the boss is going to go by the timesheet. They don't know how much time you spent on Amazon.ca or
In the washroom.
the washroom or around the coffee.
Water cooler.
Water cooler, there you go. Right, so that's why it's important to think. And these are important steps when you prepare your questionnaire. If you're asking for a response about a quantity of something, don't allow for vague responses. So if you're asking, how much time do you spend staring at your phone or watching TV, make sure that you specify how many hours, okay? Because people, if you just ask them how much time do you spend watching TV, oh, way too much. It's a very convenient response because they haven't had to think, but they've given you an answer which they believe is close to the truth. Of course, if you're doing something very qualitative and interview type, well, tell me about what you think about the amount of time you watch television, and then you'll get a story and a half, okay? Or how often do you watch the news? You know, there's another example. Do you pick once a day? Do you pick 3 times a week? And so on. Make sure that the respondents are willing to answer your question. That's important when setting questions up. Offensive questions are not going to get answered. Okay, so if you ask the question, do you still eat your meals with your fingers in your culture? Okay, very offensive question.
It could be a genuine question, but it's worded offensively.
Well, you know, I have to share this with you. Oprah Winfrey went to India about 7 years ago. And in India and in several Middle Eastern countries, people use their fingers to eat food. Partly
African
because
countries too.
African countries too, because most places, washing your hands with water is not such a big deal. Water is abundant. It's not cold. It's not freezing. You can actually wash your hand in tepid water, and it's not a big deal. So, and also there's a sense of connectedness with your food, and there's lots of sociocultural reasons. Anyway, so she goes to India, and in a very public setting, she says, "Oh, you people still eat food with your hands." And that caused such an uproar, such a stink in India that she hasn't been able to go back since. And India used to be a big market for her. You can't do that. You can't go to First Nations people and say, "Oh, you guys eat beavers and skunks." Oh, no, you can't do that. That's part of their diet, their culture, right? So if you put a questionnaire, if you have a question that is, you're talking about new immigrants coming to Canada, and you have a question there asking, do you still eat with your hands? How many times a week? Okay, that's offensive. You can't do that. Okay, so don't put questions that are offensive. Okay. There are other questions too. I mean, you could always, we'll go to impossible questions and then I'll give you that example. Avoid abbreviations. Nobody cares what your abbreviation is. Maybe you know that if I'm asking a question to the average person about research funding and I say, well, the CIHR recently awarded LU $5 million and they are going to use it for an ABC grant or an Insight grant. What do you think about this? Now the person's sitting going, wait, who's CIHR?
Who's LU? What's an ABC
LU?
grant?
What's LU? What's this Insight grant they're talking about? And now you want my opinion? I have no clue, right?
Have to define everything.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No acronym.
Assume nobody knows.
Especially look at your target audience, right? Don't assume that the respondent is familiar unless you know for a fact. So when I tell you people qualitative and quantitative research, I asked most of you several times, have you taken the research literacy course? So I talk about it because those aren't acronyms, but at least I know that you have a sense.
So all the acronyms in all the acronyms we define everything.
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
you can use acronyms, but put a bracket there, you know, just explain everything. What do you think of GSPS working with HSN? Now, you guys in Toronto are scratching your heads. What's GSPS? What's HSN? So GSPS is the Greater Sudbury Police Service. HSN is Health Sciences North. So, you know, I throw in a question about the police services and about the hospital, and all of a sudden, because of these crazy terms, it doesn't make any sense to you anymore, right? So basically, avoid acronyms, avoid formal terms, formal titles, okay? Avoid asking questions that raise more than one issue, right? So should there be, and you know, sometimes you present people with what we call sucker's choices. Sucker's choices is a sucker's choice occurs when you ask a question that seems to ask for an option between the two. Would you like to eat good food, or would you like to be able to drive a car? What kind of a question is that? That's a ridiculous question. You want both. It's not a choice. It might be a choice if you're very poor and you're trying to, you know, somehow save money. But with everything being constant, comfortable, affordable, you don't want to have to choose between one or the other. And the example I think you have in your textbook is, should there be an increase in income tax? And if so, should the increase in tax revenue be spent on art projects? So yeah, well, this is not a sucker's choice kind of question, but it makes, so you have two different things going on. Should there be an increase in taxes? That's one question. Keep that separate. Should the money raised through increased taxes go towards art projects? That's a separate question. Okay, so keep them as separate question. Try not to use colorful or emotional language. So for example, the example you have is if you had a question, do you agree that white sugar is white death? Yes or no? Very emotional, very colorful, right? Do you think that the corrupt Justin Trudeau has taken money in his dealings with the Aga Khan? Okay, come on. That's a biased question.
Biased question.
Right? And you, it's amazing. If you want to see example of biased questioning and the biased responses that come to, I'm not sure how many of you occasionally flip the channel and see Fox News. I don't recommend it. For prolonged exposure could damage our brains, but you know, a few seconds of any interview there and you'll see how the questions, it's very, very directed and it's very biased, and the responses it gets is quite challenging.
They've made it an art form.
Yeah, yes, and people revel in that kind of nonsense. Okay, better question is, sugar is bad for health. Do you agree or disagree? Okay. The next thing is, do not word questions which are called impossible questions. Have you stopped beating your wife? How do you answer that question?
Say yes, that's a recognition that you did, or no, that's
exactly.
That's
when did you
confirmation?
Have you stopped molesting children? No. You can't answer that without implicating yourself one way or the other. And when you ask questions like that, people will stop responding, they'll get offended. And that's not the objective. You want to collect data that makes sense, that is valuable to you in research. And there's no benefit gained out of these kinds of questions. Always, always examine your questions. You may have assumptions that you start with when you set out a questionnaire. You may have a bunch of school children that you ask, what does your father do for a living? You are making an assumption that
All kids have a father?
correct, correct, or
All kids' fathers are working.
correct, excellent. So everyone has a father. The father is obviously working. Big assumptions, right? And that's why you have to examine your questions every time, because you know, children are diverse with diverse setups. They may not have a father, they may be with a single mom, or they may be with a same-sex couple, and so on. Okay, and many variations of that. It's always a good idea to test your questionnaire or interview guide. So what you do is you test it out with people who are not in your sample. Corner one of your friends who you know, either will remain friends after this testing is done, or it's no big loss if they leave you, and practice with them. Okay.
But they should be similar to the target population, right?
Yes, it would be a good idea to pick someone who is probably as connected or as disconnected to your target population, because you're more likely to see how these questions work out. And if possible, test it on a few different people. If you can have a few friends, you can go ahead and do that. And hopefully your questions are worked through and so on. Okay. So one of the things which we didn't cover, we'll go back to the questions, but one of the things, because we didn't cover, we should talk about this, is measuring attitudes. Measuring attitudes is often done in qualitative research. Okay. There are several different concepts. We'll cover them now. So you measure attitudes. It's very hard to go up to a person and ask them, are you sexist? Or are you ageist? Are you racist? Are you going to get a genuine answer in that situation? I mean, you don't even have to answer. You know that's not going to happen. So how do you figure out if you want to measure attitudes about racism, about sexism, about misogyny, about whatever isms, all these isms which are unsubstantiated biases because of biologics of different people, right? That's what most of these isms are. So how do you measure these isms? How do you measure? And that's where you come into attitudinal studies.
We measure. Oh.
So attitudinal studies or attitudinal surveys, they're surveys as well. And we'll just look at an attitudinal scale. I think this is about sexism. So this is an attitudinal scale in your textbook, okay? So the person receives a sheet, they put a date in, and they're looking at sexism in this case, and they're basically attempting to identify whether people attending private or public schools are more sexist, okay? So, students answer different things. They maybe check they attended a private school, and this is the demographic part. This is demographic information. And this is important because you're trying to relate whether the type of school determines whether you're more sexist or not. And if you notice each of these questions, they first define SA, all the acronyms. SA is strongly agree, A is agree, U is uncertain, D is disagree, and SD is strongly disagree. Now, most of you have done or completed surveys of this type, whether it's with your cell phone provider, whether it's with McDonald's, you've done. Has anybody not done a survey of this type where they have to rate things?
The banks like to send you, as soon as you do a transaction, they send you a survey where you satisfied with us. What did you leave a little box? Like, do you have any comments? And can you rate our service from, 1 to 5?
Exactly. Okay. So these kinds of scales, these scales are called Likert scales. Oh, scales are spelled with a C. I know that. Okay. Likert scales typically are a 5-point scale. You get different points for what you answer. Depending on how the researcher sets it up, you can set it up in different ways. So you can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Or if you want to set it up differently, some folks, because they don't want to deal with 5 different numbers, they'll just set it up as 0, -1, -2, and then you have +1 or 1 and then 2. So you can set up the Likert scale different ways as much as you like. But the important thing about Likert scales is, well, let's go through the survey first. So it has different questions. A woman would never make a good judge. So if you're absolutely sexist, you can go here.
You'd strongly agree.
Right. And women are not as good at sports as men, you'd strongly agree again. If you're sexist and there's no chance of you being caught out, women should be encouraged to seek leadership positions. Oh God, no, right? Men should not have to wash the dishes, strongly agree, okay? Men should be left to make money decisions, strongly agree, okay? We'll come back to this one question. most of these questions, it would be set up so that you have the lowest score of 1 on strongly agree. So in this scale, most questions would be set up this way, okay? Which means if you got a very high score, what would you be? Would you be a sexist or would you not be a sexist?
You would not be sexist.
You would not be sexist if you get a high score, okay? But look at this question. If you got a strongly disagree, okay, you would get a 5 here, but that's a question that's measuring sexism, correct?
Yeah.
That would mess up your score. Do you agree?
Yes.
Okay, that would mess up your score completely. So because we're looking at a person who's very sexist, so what scientists do is they reverse the scale on the question. So just for this question, this would be 1, this would be 2, this would be 3, this would be 4, and this would be 5. Okay, so if you're scoring poorly, you're getting 1, 1, 1, and you pick this, you're still just getting a 1. And you continue to get your 1s, and therefore you have a score of 5. You're horribly sexist, and you should go for some kind of rehabilitation. Anyway, the point is, this reversing the scale is important. There are reasons why scientists reverse the scale. Can you think of why you would want to reverse a scale on an attitudinal survey? Why would you want to reverse the scale? They didn't do it just for fun. They did it for a reason. I want you folks to think about what it could be. Why would you want to reverse the scale? I mean,
could it be so that participants don't notice patterns in their answers? Like they notice that they're scoring all of like one particular row?
Well, exactly. So Charlotte suggests that people don't just start following a pattern to get the attitudinal survey done. So you basically want to get a true read of the participants' scores. So participants might think that if you wanted to pretend, okay, that let's hypothetically say that the person responding to this is actually is sexist but doesn't want to come across as sexist, okay? So what they're going to do, what you would assume they would do is, oh, women would never make a good judge. Okay, let me just say disagree. Let me say women are not as, let me just say disagree. And should not be, let me just say disagree. And they just go with a pattern which they think demonstrates that they don't have a sexist attitude. When you have a confounding like this, which just because of how the question is set up, reverses, goes in the face of what is mostly being indicated, you can actually toss that questionnaire out.
Because the majority of the other questions were pretty straightforward and the person would have answered as accurately as
Correct.
they could, you know.
Correct. So you can either toss it out because you think the person may be pretending. You can also toss it out perhaps because the person isn't paying attention. They just want to get the thing done because you know what? They have 5 minutes of their life that they're willing to give you. They're just going zip, 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 zip. I'm done here. Can I get my Tim Hortons card? Thank you for my, you are allowed to give people small incentives to take their time and help you out in a research project. So there are multiple reasons why scientists will often switch scales or reverse scales when doing an attitudinal study, okay? So attitudinal scales are very useful in uncovering underlying attitudes. Now, this is not a very skilled questionnaire in the sense you can still read this and you can still see what's being looked for. Some Likert scales are like the really effective ones. You don't have any idea how this question, how like when you answer this question, what can be interpreted. Okay, so they'll have very good questionnaires or attitudinal scales will often have you answer some very basic, straightforward questions. And the questions are very sensitive to measuring who you are, but they do it in such a way that a lot of the questions you don't really know, oh, should I pick this answer? And the reason that it's done that way is so that people have to answer with how they feel. They really don't have a choice. They can't actually speculate as to what the researcher is looking for. And that's the whole idea. Okay. Okay, so that's about attitudinal scales. I think we did an attitudinal scale in class last year. Let me see if I can dig up that. So we created an attitudinal survey regarding smart pills. Now, do all of you know what smart pills are?
I don't.
Me neither.
Okay, Charlotte says no, Aretha says no, Courtney shakes her head, Marianne shakes her head, and so does Jessie. I don't know if it's a big deal here in Canada or if it is a big deal right now, but when I was in graduate school, a bunch of kids would, have you heard of the drug Ritalin? Ritalin is,
I've heard the name.
okay. Ritalin is a medication used to help individuals with ADD or ADHD. What it does is people with ADD or ADHD can't remain focused for too long because of different biochemistry and different neurological setup that they have. So what this medication does is it soothes them to the point that they can focus. And in the end, maximum learning happens through focus. So a lot of kids in the US, especially in the University of Vermont undergrads, they would take these, they would call them smart pills. Because before the exam, when you're all stressed, 90% of people are stressed before an exam. And as a result of stress, you don't actually absorb as much information. I'm just going to mute the person. Okay, there we go. So 90% of people are stressed. And as a result of stress, what happens is you don't absorb information as well. And when you're preparing for an exam, that's the last thing you need. So people would pop Ritalin pills. And in the US, it is a prescribed drug, so you can't get it easily. So people would find illegal sources of Ritalin, pop those pills. And then they could, despite the stress, they could stay awake and stay focused. And obviously you'd perform better on your exams. And this is more of a recent event. But when the Nazis were invading Europe, Hitler's troops used to get not Ritalin, but they used to get meth, an equivalent of meth, crystal meth in those days. So these troops could stay focused and in battle for 48, 72 hours at a time with no sleep. Okay. So people have used these. Anyway, the questionnaire was to check attitudes on the use of a smart pill. So I explained to the class what a smart pill was, and we put out a questionnaire looking at attitude towards a smart pill. Are people supportive? Are people disappointed? Do people see it as an unfair advantage, and so on? So it was a very similar questionnaire, except it had 10 items and I had flipped the polarity. It was fun. It was just a classroom exercise. It wasn't a research project or anything. So there are different things that you can create attitudinal surveys for. Attitudinal surveys to increasing tax in order to support older adult friendly environments, so you can set up something like that and so on. Anyway, yeah, I think we covered I'm just making sure we didn't miss anything. I think you understand how the scales work, and I think you all understand the reversal of the scale. There is a section talking about the creation of strong questions and weak questions. I think I can let you, I'm going to let you guys read that because it's pretty straightforward. We looked at records to measure variables and concepts. Oh, So I'm not sure we spoke about content analysis. Content analysis in qualitative research, you can use it for as a semi-quantitative method too, but mostly it's a way to examine records and documents in publication. And then you're looking for themes in written document, in print. You can do it different ways. You can look at the context in which an article was written. You can look at popular themes that come out of reading different types of publications, and so on. But again, the steps always tend to be the same. You always have to clarify and narrow your research objective and hypothesis. What are the concepts involved? You have to identify the variables that you're measuring for, because otherwise you don't know what you're reading to identify, right? Again, you have to devise a way to measure variables. So it's not very different from the standard research process at all. And that's why you have a little bit of. So none of these different methods of qualitative research have that much of a variability in how you will go through the steps. Only thing is, like we were looking at the last chart at the beginning of the lecture, where there's a recursive process, which means you go, you measure stuff and you have units of measurement, and then you go ahead and you start collecting data. And then you come back, you may have to change variables sometimes, but that is rare. More often, it's the collection phase where you start to build more sensitivity by going in loops, okay? So this is an example of a content analysis questionnaire where they're looking at storybooks written in the 60s and 70s, I believe, where they're looking at who the protagonist or who the hero is, or what the books are like that are written for adolescents. And depending on the books you're reading, are boys shown to dominate girls in over half the stories? Are girls shown to win against boys in less than half the story? I'm just making this up as we go along. Is unisex clothing used? If you're looking at the 60s and 70s, probably. Are women shown in traditionally male roles?
More so now than before.
Right, right. Does a male ask a female for help or directions or information if it was in the 60s or 70s? Rarely.
No.
Are females shown to be helpless?
In a lot of movies, yes. More
Right.
so then than now.
Right, damsel in distress kind of situation. So, but you know, you can go through a bunch of, it doesn't have to be books, it could be movies. So you start looking at movies from the 60s and 70s. And well, even current day movies, there is still a lot of gendered role play in traditional films as well. But you have more and more women empowerment. That's why you have Captain Marvel, which I don't know if you watch Marvel movies. I love Marvel movies. But anyway, Marvel movies, Captain Marvel is female, right? I mean, if you look at the old comic books, have you seen Captain Marvel in the old comic books? Do you remember, male or female?
Male.
Yes, exactly. Right. So it's so even you can do that for movies, you can do that for comic books, you can do that for a bunch of different things. Basically, you can create a content analysis checklist and you can start collecting data. When you start to create your theory, you know, in qualitative research, you can start to diagram your theory as well. So if you're doing content analysis of published material since World War II, an increasing proportion of Canadian married women have been employed. So more and more women are participating in the workforce since, you know, World War II. So you can diagram it using two boxes. So you can see the increase in married women in the workforce is directly proportional to the increase, or the increase was reflected proportionally in content oriented to women in publications. So as women became more powerful, had more of a voice, there was more content that was believed by publication houses that women would consume, right? It's true now. Now that the articles that you read these days and the articles I used to read growing up, when I was younger, even if I look at a simple magazine such as Reader's Digest, the content was skewed towards male readers. Now when you read Reader's Digest, it's much more of a neutral tone, maybe in fact a little more towards women, but I would say more neutral now than it ever was. But that's a recent development. Okay. I think I'm going to call time on class today simply because I had mentioned before we have a school strike going on and I have the limited use of a babysitter. So we will continue our discussion on Thursday.
I remember that. I was wondering, I was looking at the time and like, did he not say today?
No, well, I'll rush and my babysitter won't be mad because I'll only be 5 minutes late. So she'll be okay. But thank you for your understanding and we will continue where we left off next class. Okay, have a good couple of days.
Okay, thank you, Professor. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, where's my, oh.